Welcome to Trust Talk. Our guest today is Anu Bradford, the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia Law School, and the author of Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology. She explores the complex digital future where technology, regulation, innovation, and trust intersect, and discusses the distinct regulatory paths of the US, China, and the EU, predicting a world split between techno-democracies and autocracies. Delving into the geopolitical intricacies, Bradford sheds light on the challenges faced by companies like NVIDIA and ASML amidst global tech tensions. Her profound insights into the power dynamics between tech giants, states, and the need for assertive regulation offer a nuanced perspective on building a balanced, trust-centered digital society, navigating the interplay of technology, policy, democracy, and trust in this episode. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Anu, welcome to Trust Talk. When we spoke in preparation of this podcast, you said that you are the expert in EU laws and regulations, and that you were about to finish your book, Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology. I figured out how we could fit that in for our Trust Talk podcast, because it's all about trust. And you had absolutely no hesitation to talk with me about trust and this subject. So let's just do that. As a professor in EU laws and regulations, what brought you to write this book?
Yeah, so first of all, Severin, thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to have this conversation with you. So what was the motivation for this book? So this book follows after my earlier book, The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. So I'm very interested in economic regulation. I'm interested in the relationship between the state and the market. And I'm interested in Europe's place in the world. So in the Brussels Effect, I examined how the European Union has become this regulatory superpower that has the ability to regulate the global marketplace. And in the aftermath of publishing that book, there were many conversations that tended to turn towards digital economy. And many people ask me, well, what about the digital economy? The EU doesn't seem to be capable of producing any tech companies. How does it navigate the increasingly heated tech war between the United States and China? And what is the EU's role and place in the digital world? So the idea really behind the digital empires was to try to examine this broad geopolitical landscape of the digital economy, and then the relative roles of the European Union, the United States, and China in shaping that digital economy and society.
Okay, let's go into that then. You talk about three digital empires, the US, China, and the EU. Aren't we then giving too much weight on countries rather than on mighty corporations and corporate titans?
So I love this question, Severin, because I really started the book by looking at this more state-centric view of the digital economy and the different ways that the three leading jurisdictions, the US and China and the EU, regulate the digital economy. But the more I was writing, the more palpable I had this feeling that, look, are the real digital empires actually the tech giants themselves and not the states? When I look at the difficulties that the United States has in passing any legislation in this domain, or the many struggles that the EU has had in effectively enforcing its digital regulations. So these tech giants in many ways behave like states. If you look at the economic power, the political power, the cultural power that they exert in shaping the lives of individuals and our societies, I think is exactly the question that we should be asking, and that I will ask towards the end of the book then, as to whether we end up living in a society that is not governed by the governments, by the states, but rather that is governed by the tech companies themselves.
You describe how these three empires shape global digital policies and practices with a focus on different regulatory models. The US prioritizes market-driven approaches, China emphasizes state control, and the EU focuses on rights protection. What does this difference tell you?
I think the main takeaway is that there seems to be now a global consensus that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no global consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So even if you look at the three leading technology and regulatory powers, they all have a very distinct vision for the digital economy and society and have then pioneered a very different regulatory model to realize that vision that they have. So I distinguish between the US market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. So if I very quickly lay out the basic distinctions across these three models, the American market-driven model really prioritizes free speech, free internet, and the incentives to innovate. So it reserves a very trivial role for the government and basically hands over the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-libertarian, techno-optimist view of the world. The Chinese are trying to do something different. China is very focused on making China a technological superpower, and they are prepared to leverage state resources to reach that goal. But China is also deploying technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to maintain political control of the Communist Party and ensure a social stability in the nation. The Europeans are often described or viewed as being forced to choose between the Chinese and the American digital world, not having a technology industry on its own. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not able to, nor are they forced to, choose between the US and China. The Chinese model for the Europeans is simply too oppressive, but the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have pioneered their own third way forward. And it is really based on their vision of a human-centric digital transformation where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals and the preservation of democratic structures of the society and a pursuit of a more fair digital economy where the power is redistributed away from the tech giants to smaller players, to individual users, and to the society at large. So these are, in my view, the three primary different ways to think about digital governance today.
You just said there is a broad consensus for a need of regulations, but in my view, but I might be completely mistaken, and please correct me, the tech industry, I thought, had a predominant sound to have less rules from the government and a big focus on free markets. So how do you think this approach helps or hinders tech companies, especially when it comes to new ideas, raising money and dealing with big issues like trust in AI, internet freedom and user privacy?
Severin, I think initially the tech companies were adamant that this was the only path towards economic freedom, political freedom, the kind of prosperity where they were the key architects of our digital society. And it is very clear the tech companies don't like regulation. They want to be free to set their own rules. And that is exactly what they have been doing for a long time. But there comes a point where this free-for-all techno-libertarian worldview has created the kind of society where we have seen a backlash against these tech companies. In many ways, the tech companies, they were set free to take over the world, and that's exactly what they done. And in the process, they became too powerful. And they today control our societies in ways that people have lost their trust that these tech companies can anymore handle the power that they are possessing. And we see a backlash. We see demands that the regulators step back in and take control of our digital destinies and start shaping our digital societies and rein in the power of these tech companies. So in many ways, I think that the tech companies got much more than they bargained for. They find themselves being now often almost in charge of our democracy or geopolitical destinies when they are moderating content around wars in Israel, Palestine, or in Ukraine. So this seems to be now that the tech companies have the kind of power today that they cannot anymore responsibly handle. And that's why, in many ways, the tech companies now find themselves in the situation when there's an onslaught of regulation aimed at them. And they are probably facing more regulation than they would face if the development of the power and market position had been more moderate and more graduate. So, in that sense, this is now a new reality for the tech companies. And I think many of the tech companies now accept that regulation is inevitable. There's no way going back to the world where the tech companies are trusted to be left to their own devices to shape the society. So now just the question is not whether we regulate, but how we regulate these companies.
Anu, let's move to China. They, as you describe, have a distinctive approach to technology. You told us the significant state intervention and regulation. Considering this, how do major Chinese tech companies like Tencent, Alibaba, Meituan, JD.com, ByteDance, etc. navigate and adapt to this regulatory environment? And what common strategies or characteristics do these companies share that enable them to thrive even under this Chinese state-driven model?
So, Severin, I think first we need to acknowledge something that most of us who believe in liberal democracy are quite uncomfortable acknowledging, which is that these tech companies have been extremely successful, even though they have grown under the state-driven model. In many ways, they have shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to become very innovative without being free. And I think that is a hard message for us to come to terms with, because it is very different to what we always advocated for as a sort of necessary foundation for a thriving digital society. So these companies are successful for a variety of reasons. And first of all, they are not only successful because they have benefited from state subsidies. Yes, they have benefited from state support, but they've also benefited from tremendous venture capital, including American venture capital, which already shows us that none of these regulatory models are pure. State doesn't control everything in China. There are market-driven elements, including then the access to venture capital that has been significant for the creation and growth of these companies. But for these companies to operate in China, they have had some benefits, including that the Chinese government has basically shielded them from foreign competition. With the censorship regime, it's the reality that companies like Google's search engine is not operational in China. There is no Facebook or Instagram, and that has created then the space for the Chinese companies to grow and dominate the marketplace. And these companies know the rules. They know the censorship rules. They know who is the boss and what does it take to be able to safely operate a company that is involved in social media or information management in the Chinese society. And they are the kind of rules that are very difficult for any American company to come to terms with and justify to their own constituencies, employees, and shareholders, and so forth. So in many ways, these Chinese companies have had a certain benefit of being able to take advantage of the vast Chinese market. But there was a very interesting shift in 2021, because up until then, the Chinese government had basically left these companies alone to grow and to thrive. There was very little regulation outside of those censorship and other political control mechanisms. But there was very little regulation otherwise. But then the Chinese government came to realize that these companies are probably now getting more powerful than the state itself. And that doesn't work in China. And there was concern of exploitation of Chinese consumers, the unequal growth, and the need to pursue what the Chinese government calls for common prosperity, and also then the harness of the power of these companies to advance that political goal. So there was a very sudden shift towards greater regulation. And we saw massive reduction of the stock market value of these companies. So it wasn't that these companies were insulated from that regulatory shift. And I think it still remains to be seen of how the future of the tech regulation affects the growth prospects of these companies. The Chinese government really seems to be straddling between its urge now to regulate and make sure that it retains control, but it also has this palpable sense that it needs to continue to let these companies grow and be successful, because they are engines of economic growth for China. And these are also the companies that are critical for China's technological supremacy, which is central in the ongoing tech war against the United States. So I think it is going to be very interesting what happens in the coming years as the Communist Party is trying to balance its commercial economic goals and the political imperatives that are also central.
The result of this struggle that you just described is, of course, the tensions that occur, the geopolitical trust issues, if you like. One of the incidents I refer to is with NVIDIA, the incident in the US Congress where the US is seeking export restrictions to China, like our Dutch ASML, the lithography equipment maker. How do these trust challenges lead to, and if they lead to, significant adjustments in tech regulation strategies?
There's a couple of issues that are worth highlighting here, both relating to trust. So one issue is that the American tech companies are very eager to take advantage of the vast Chinese market, but they face the struggle with their own government now wanting to restrict their access to the Chinese market because they want to make sure that China doesn't gain access to strategic technologies. So NVIDIA is one of those companies that has the interest to sell in China, but that needs to navigate this increasingly geopoliticized technology policy whereby their opportunities to do so are restricted by the US government. And in many ways, this is exactly the direction that we are heading around the world when the geopolitical tensions are elevating, the trust among the governments is eroding. Very few of the governments anymore trust that they can rely on global supply chains. And we see this urge to move towards strategic autonomy, digital sovereignty. This is now very much part of the European conversation as well. Europeans are very concerned that they are too dependent on access to Chinese technologies, American technologies, and feel the need to create a greater technological or digital sovereignty as a result. So this does increase pressures towards technological decoupling. It does reduce prospects for cooperation because that cooperation relies on there being a minimal level of trust, which is now increasingly missing. And it also then elevates tensions, which then continues to feed into this cycle that we see less cooperation, less comfort in relying in foreign supply chains, and an adjustment towards greater techno-protectionism and techno-nationalism.
Given what you just said, what's your perspective on the long-term impacts of these actions on the global digital economy, and how do you see this shaping the future of international tech collaboration and innovation?
So I think we are in between rivalry and restraint. So I expect that these tensions are going to continue. I don't unfortunately see the tensions between the US and China to reconcile or mitigate it significantly anytime soon. And that continues to push the countries towards gradual decoupling. So we are going to see export controls and investment restrictions, whether inbound or outbound investment restrictions. We are going to see the subsidy races as each player is trying to shore up their own innate technological capabilities. But at the same time, I don't think we are going to see anything approaching full decoupling of the global tech economy. It is just simply not feasible for any player, even a powerful player like the United States or China, to declare technological sovereignty. If you think about sectors like semiconductors, these are very complicated tech ecosystems, supply chains, whereby many components of these long supply chains are controlled by different players. So the US controls the design of semiconductors. The Europeans, especially the Dutch ASML, is a major player in the equipment needed to produce the most sophisticated semiconductors. Then China does a lot of assembly, but a lot of the manufacturing is in Taiwan. So none of the countries is able to reshore all of these components of the supply chain and say that, look, we are just going to build the entire semiconductor supply chain within our national borders. So we are going to see continuing pressures to engage in trade. We are going to see the companies put pressures on their governments that they need access to foreign markets. So that, I think, maintains this status quo for quite a while, which is this costly yet ultimately manageable conflict between the countries. So far from full decoupling, but at the same time, it does require a lot of effort to manage the tensions that are prevalent and that likely will continue.
If you were to advise ASML, the Dutch company, how to best handle these geopolitical pressures from both China, the EU and the US, being a relatively big company in a small country, what would be your advice?
So interestingly, how the ASML has approached these strategic decisions is that even though it would probably have a pure commercial interest to continue to access all the markets around the world, it is aware of the strategic significance of the products that it's producing and its monopoly position in that field. And it has agreed to basically collaborate with Americans and Japanese in restricting the exportation of those equipment to China. So it seems that the Dutch are moving along with the rest of the Europe towards a more geopoliticized vision of technology industry. For quite a while, the Europeans were unwilling to take as hawkish position on China as the Americans were taking. The Europeans are more exposed to having access to the Chinese market. They need that access even more. And they were kind of willing to try to hedge their bets and continue to find a way to seize those commercial opportunities. But I think that attitude generally has shifted, and the Europeans have moved towards a more hard line against China. And I think there are a few reasons for that. So first of all, China is increasingly a partner that the Europeans don't trust. China is increasingly seen as a strategic rival. And when China refused to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think that hardened the attitudes in Europe. So the Europeans realized that this is not a partner that we can necessarily work with. This is not the partner we can trust. We are in the different sides of geopolitical divide, and we need to approach China more geostrategically. And I think that entails then moving closer to the US view that has meant in practice that we need to limit China's access to strategic technologies. And ASML is obviously an absolute key player in this particular effort. So I think that's what the ASML has done. But it is interesting if you think about then the continuation of aligning the cooperation strategies with the United States, with the approaching presidential elections in the US, and what the Europeans need to make of the future of transatlantic cooperation. I think the Europeans are still reeling from the very dramatic Trump presidency, and the prospect of a repeat of those 4 years is very unsettling for European corporations and for European governments. So I think ASML will need to make very critical commercial, geopolitical decisions also in the coming years, where it's going to remain a central player in the ongoing tech war.
In your book, you predict a bipolar digital world split between techno-democracies and techno-autocracies. How does that world look like?
Yeah, so I make a couple of predictions in the book. One prediction is that this American market-driven regulatory model is increasingly declining. So the people and the governments around the world no longer trust the tech companies. They don't trust the fundamental assumptions under this techno-libertarian worldview, which means that the democracies of the world are increasingly coalescing behind a variation of the European rights-driven model. So this is now the heart of the coalition of the techno-democracies. But at the same time, there's a large segment of the world, the authoritarian countries or authoritarian-leaning countries that are approaching the Chinese model, that are emulating aspects of the state-driven model. They look at China and say, look, this is exactly what I want. I don't want the rights. I want control. I don't want my digital technologies to be deployed as a tools for democracies, but they are tools for control, for autocracies. So the Chinese model is also doing extremely well. So I see the bipolar world emerging, whereby we have a group of techno-autocracies pursuing an alternative path, a different from that pursued by techno-democracies. And there is going to be some geopolitical contestation that is economic in nature, that is ideological, that is geopolitical in its nature. And so that is going to be one of the main rivalries, because it really ultimately is a battle over the future of liberal democracy as the central pillar of our digital society. And I worry, and I think this is the message or call to action, if you like, to all the techno democracies, is that we need to be mindful that in this fundamental battle, liberal democracy can be lost one of two ways. So one way is if the techno democracies of the world lose their horizontal battle to China, and the world is turning more digital authoritarian. But liberal democracy is also lost if the US and the EU and their allies lose the vertical battle to tech companies. And ultimately, then it's the tech companies that are controlling our digital societies. And neither is comfortable conclusion for anybody who believes in digital economy being guided and built on the principles of liberal democracy. So ultimately, I think we come back to this where we started our conversation, Severin, that there is the question, who do we trust to govern us? Do we trust the tech companies? And I think increasingly people say that they don't. But then there are many who think that, look, can we really trust the governments? And if, then what kind of government models? Like how do the governments then ought to govern the digital economy? And here ultimately for the liberal democracies, I think the key is that we need to have a democratic foundation for the digital society. And that means that you do not hand over the reins of that society to the tech companies any more than you want to hand it over to authoritarian governments.
My last question, Anu. How can assertive digital regulations like the one we are now having or contemplating in the EU, what role does that play in the vision that you just expressed?
So I think that the EU's digital regulations, which are very ambitious, we talk about data privacy, we talk about antitrust or competition law, we talk about content moderation, artificial intelligence. The Europeans have really pioneered not only a vision for the rights-driven model, but a set of comprehensive regulations to really realize that vision and convert it into a tools for legislation. But what is now really key is that the Europeans can show to the world that they can also enforce that vision, that they can actually change the market outcomes, and they can implement that vision into concrete results. And here again, I think the stakes are extremely high, because what we are observing is that America has not even managed to really regulate in this space. The Chinese government doesn't have a difficulty of legislating. The Europeans can legislate, but the Europeans have had a difficulty of enforcing. China hasn't had a difficulty of enforcing. If the Chinese Communist Party decides that it's time to crack down on big tech, it is time to crack down on big tech. So this is really a test case, a moment where the Europeans need to show to themselves and to the world that there is a liberal democratic way to govern technology and what that governance looks like in practice. So the stakes are extremely high for the Europeans right now to show that the tools that they have, they can deploy those tools for the benefit of individuals and democratic societies at large.
Absolutely fascinating what we are heading to. Anu, thank you very much for being our guest today. I hope your book will do well. I'm sure after this interview people will know more of it, and I would only recommend them to read the book. Most of it I read. It was fantastic. Thank you very much, Anu, and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.